Indeed, it's the job site that makes hiring as easy as
the truth frequency.
We are TFR. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and this evening I am excited to bring back to the Revolutionary Radio Project my friend and scholar, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, are you there?
I am here, Rob.
All right, man. Good to have you. It looks like it's been a few months since you were on here, and you contacted me recently. You said you had some new stuff to talk about. I think my audience is probably fairly well familiar with you if they've paid attention to my archives, but just by way of quick review, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll jump in here.
Certainly. I'm primarily a historian of religion. I have a PhD in history with a focus on religion, the Greco-Roman world, and early Christianity, but also have interest in, world history and prehistory. Lots of stuff in antiquities. I have a master's degree in anthropology and history, so I've got the ethnological, the cultural anthropological training and the archaeological training as well. And I've done work on both sides of the globe. I've done work in Israel, of course, at Bonias. That's probably what most people know me from, is my work on the Peneus region. I wrote a religious history of that site, and I've done numerous surveys and excavations in Texas, and anthropological work in Peru and Mexico, Ireland, all over the states, the greater Southwest, with more to come. But that being said, I sort of wear the proverbial shoes of three different professions: historian, anthropologist, and archaeologist.
Nice. Yeah, I recently posted a series of videos called A Filmmaker's Journey that chronicle the last 11 years of me trying to get seed from ideas scribbled on napkins to the completion of our first 8-minute teaser project. And in that, it was fun. It was a fun exercise for me just to go through and look at the journey and how far it has taken us along the way. But in part of that, I had was talking about research that I was doing on the Nephilim and stuff. And when I got the Conehead skull replica there, and you were here in Dallas, and you gave me a professional view of that from a medical anthropological perspective. And so I don't know if you got a chance to see that, but I included that clip in there of you doing that, doing your Shakespeare moment there with the with the skull in front of you.
Yes. The last poor Horatio, I knew him well.
Horatio, yeah. Cone-headed Horatio.
That's right.
Yeah. Are you doing any more stuff in that regard? Dealing with the Peru and your trips with L.A. Marzulli or anything like that?
Well, of course, the Peru stuff is never far from my mind because it's interesting and anomalous. But in terms of the more like bioarchaeology or physical archaeology, I haven't done any of that recently, but I've done plenty of the cultural work, folklore, mythology side of anthropology. I've done quite a bit of that lately.
Yeah. Hey, man, you're looking good, man. You losing weight?
I have lost some weight. Now, I'll tell you, I don't recommend doing it the way that I did it. I was quite ill a couple of weeks ago. I had some stomach bug. It was a real attack. I mean, I'm confident about that. But it kept me down for about a week, and then it took about another week for me to get my strength back. Just eating it, because I couldn't really keep anything down. spare you the gory details, but
Thanks.
but yeah, I'm actually, I'm being mindful about staying on that track and keeping my weight down. So I don't recommend that as a way to jumpstart your weight loss journey, but yeah, I am losing some weight.
Montezuma's revenge.
Yeah, they call it or shilshul in the Middle East is what they call it.
Yeah. When I was going through my divorce, man, that's another way. I don't recommend losing weight, but that's a heck of a weight loss program.
Yeah.
I dropped
I've been there too.
dropped like 25 pounds. Not that I needed to lose it, but that was a pretty brutal. So there are good ways and bad ways to lose weight, but whatever it takes, right? Yeah. So you contacted me recently, said you've been doing a lot of research regarding the subject of witchcraft.
Right.
That's typically something we start talking about around the time of Halloween. But here we are in the middle of May, and you're like, "Hey, I'm looking into witchcraft. Want to talk about it?" Yeah, sure. So,
well, we're in the wake of another, both for neo-pagans and Luciferian, which is, the Walpurgisnacht, May Day, is a holiday on the calendar, and so. I've been on a couple of shows talking about, that very topic, and I think it's as timely, now because as it is around Halloween, because, they don't take breaks, they're active all year round, and sacred space and sacred time are components of what they do. And of course, witchcraft, the history of witchcraft, its culture is also never really far from my mind. As a historian, I have a teaching field in early modern Europe and medieval Europe, and a lot of the work that I did in that regard had to do with the history of witchcraft. And of course, in my master's work, I wrote my thesis on neo-paganism, and did quite a bit of work on the study of witchcraft as a worldwide phenomenon. In other words, how it manifests and how it shows up in the various cultures of the world.
Certainly seems to be everywhere. That's for sure. So
yeah, it's a perennial feature in world culture. You're hard pressed to find a society over space or time that didn't have these kinds of functionaries that operated, typically on the fringes of society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was let me see if I can find it real quick. There was a YouTube channel that I just recently stumbled across that had a lot of anthropological and like dealing with psychology of nations and things like that, series of videos on there. It's a YouTube channel called Academy of Ideas is the name of the YouTube channel. And mass psychosis and demons, and just like how psychology is leveraged within the occult, and things like the various witchcraft phases that almost, this one guy was saying like so many women were killed in certain areas of like Germany and different places like that because of this mass hysteria that was
the witch craze.
Yeah, that like there was hardly any women left in the town because everybody just got totally wigged out and freaked out about this, and went into this mass hysteria about it. Witchcraft, of course, the word itself carries a lot of baggage, but from your studies, how do you define it?
Well, I usually begin with the anthropological definition, which, actually is pretty congruent with the biblical definition. A witch is an individual who operates completely anathema to what the given cultural norm is. So whatever's considered good and valuable and beneficial and kind or moral, the witch typically operates opposite of that. they utilize their abilities to bend nature in favor of some nefarious end, and of course they use supernatural means in order to do that, often involving the contact of spirits. So the demonic mechanism is very much there. It's not always just in cultural context. It's not always described as such, but for believers, it doesn't take a whole lot of discernment to figure out that that's what's at play here, is this interface with the demonic to basically bend nature to some malevolent aim. I recently, well, before I go down that rabbit trail, the second part of that definition, the biblical qualifier, if you will, has to do with the fact that that a witch, whether male or female, has been under the direct tutelage of a demon to learn their craft. And I distinguish this from neo-pagan witchcraft because the kind that I'm alluding to is the pure Luciferian satanic witchcraft. Not that neo-paganism isn't dangerous. We know that it has its pitfalls, but these are people that subscribe to and submit to the corporeal evil that believers all know as Satan, as the devil. And so you can see how the biblical perspective on witchcraft is very, very much congruent with the anthropological definition of a witch.
So, did you watch WandaVision?
I've seen a couple of episodes of WandaVision. I haven't seen the entire series.
It was kind of a dud anyway, but like if you only saw like the first few episodes, you're probably thinking, what the heck is this? Because it was all done up like 1950s and 60s, 70s TV shows. But basically the premise of it was that she was, because Vision, from the Avengers movies and stuff like that, he was killed and they had some kind of relationship going on, and so she's grieving, and she's created sort of her own grief bubble where she can live out her fantasy world and not deal with the pain. And so she's created like this ideal environment, and it's sort of modeled after sitcoms and pop culture TV shows and stuff like that. So the first few episodes is like, what is this? I mean, especially if you're used to your typical fanfare for Marvel movies, this wasn't it. You're like, this is like Marvel meets I Love Lucy or something. You're like, what? But she's the was it Scarlet Witch or something?
Scarlet Witch. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So in pop culture, we see a lot of the sort of this idea of the white witch or the good witch versus the bad witch, especially like in Disney movies and stuff like that. But even like in Lord of the Rings, the same type of thing. So in your studies, what's up with that? I mean, from a biblical perspective, it would seem to me that both are wrong. But you seem there's a lot in pop culture that would try to portray you have a good side of witchcraft and a bad side of witchcraft. So, what have your studies revealed in that regard?
Well, and usually, those people that identify as neo-pagan witches of one sort or another, Wiccans and modern druids, solitary practitioners, eclectics, those kinds of people, will claim that their motives are good, and the lion's share of them don't subscribe to the belief in the Christian devil, and so they base their goodness basically on that. And one thing you have to remember about neo-paganism for the most part is that their morality is based in relativism. Their main philosophy, moral philosophy, is that if it doesn't harm anybody, then do whatever you want to. Well, that's not that's not really moral fortitude. That's more like a license to interpret morality and ethics as you see them. And so, you and I have talked about this before. It's a problem with postmodernism when you have, when truth is relative, when you don't believe in an objective truth. Well, that just sort of undergirds any validity to the morality that you claim to subscribe to. And there are dangers inherent in that, because even though they profess not to believe in the devil or to be under demonic influence, that makes them all the more susceptible to that. Oftentimes, without their knowing. So it's a dangerous gambit. That's why I say it's not without its own pitfalls and dangers, but it's a different kind of witchcraft altogether than the the kinds of like the maleficarium that's described in a lot of the historical church documents.
Speaking of church documents, back in I would say 2005 through really about 2007 timeframe, Sheila and I were really striving to try to understand the gifts of the Spirit. I'm of the opinion. Now, I grew up in a Baptist background that taught cessation, the gifts of the Spirit passed away with the apostles and whatnot. But for myself, studying Scripture, I don't see that as the case. I understand that church has brought up doctrine to try to establish that as a case. But when I read the book of Acts, it's a ... Paul got his head cut off, and Luke apparently went on to do other things. But at that time, they're out there doing all this stuff that Jesus himself said. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, all that stuff. So, I believe that healing and prophecy and the various gifts of the Spirit are still very much in action today. And at that time, 2003 to 2007, we were really seeking and pressing in and praying a lot and trying to understand all of that, and going to various meetings where people who claimed to operate in the gifts of the Spirit were giving presentations or whatever to try to help you to walk in it. But I quickly began to discern that there are many people within the, let's say, the prophet gift that I do believe that they have a sensitivity to the spirit realm. And I believe many of them start out as sincere Christians walking in the gift of prophecy, but we are told in Scripture to test the spirits to see whether they be of God. And in the experiences that I had, observing the different things, it seems to me that many people who may have started out walking in the legitimate gift of the Spirit of prophecy didn't continue to do that testing, and other spirits started coming in and they weren't testing it. And next thing you know, entire ministries are out there doing things that, from my perspective, are blatant witchcraft. Grave sucking and all kinds of stuff like that. So it just seems to me that it's crafty in how it can weave its way even into the church.
Absolutely. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Greg Reed. He's a good friend of mine. He wrote a book a number of years ago dealing with some of those topics called The Trojan Church. And he basically said that we were so busy, putting up such a bolster for the vanguard of the church that Satan sort of creeped in through the back door, and you end up, with churches that have yoga classes and this kind of woo-woo, new age, harmonic convergence, spiritism stuff that creeps into the church too. And it's blatant witchcraft. It's what the people in the New Testament, the apostles and disciples, would have called pharmakeia. That's where we get our word pharmacy from. That was the word for sorcery or witchcraft. And it's clearly witchcraft.
Yeah, I mean, when you start seeing Christian yoga classes and stuff showing up, and you're like, guys, start looking into the Kundalini spirit and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, but for others in the audience, if they haven't ever checked it out, they should check out the book, The Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, because the premise of the book is like there's a senior demon training a junior demon on how to be most effective, and this junior demon, is trying to learn ways of, being more effective and whatever, and the senior demon says, let's go set up shop in the church, and of course the demon's like, what? They're going to cast us out. He goes, no. I mean, yeah, they can do that, but, and like, so the part about the book that really impacted me was that the senior demon was saying the best place for them to set up shop is the church, but they have to do it in a way that's very crafty, that's very subtle, that's very deceptive, but getting in there and getting the church to, first of all, the church is truly walking in the Spirit with the power of the Holy Spirit, has enormous power, but most people don't know that, and they get them to be passive and teach things like this stuff passed away with the gifts of the death of the apostles, so you don't have to deal with it. But I mean, when the demons in that book set up shop in the church and they show how they are very crafty at manipulating within the church, that was like, and then of course followed that up when Frank Peretti put out This Present Darkness. Wow,
groundbreaking book,
big time. Yeah,
definitely. The ramifications of I should preface what I'm going to say with this, that there was some interesting commentary coming out of the 50s and 60s with people like C.S. Lewis, but as you were talking about that, I also thought of, and you probably heard this, and your listeners have probably too, this prognostication that Paul Harvey made about, if I were the devil, I would do this, that, and the other, and it's just mind-blowing because so much of that has already come to pass. Not only in our society, but in other societies around the world, and it's a lot of that is very much rooted in witchcraft, and as it's crept into the church, more and more people have become unnervingly comfortable, with these kinds of things, so much so that there are compromises to their understanding of basic biblical theology, and the corresponding corresponding downward curve, of course, is in biblical literacy, the drop in biblical literacy.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I mean, technology is great, but I started noticing going into the 2000s especially that fewer and fewer people were actually bringing their Bible to church anymore because it was always just projected on the screen. So the pastor, would have whatever scripture references he's going to be talking about for his sermon just up on the screen, and people started realizing, well, he's just going to put it up on the screen, so I don't even need to bring my Bible to church anymore. And I started noticing that more and more, especially in the 2000s. So, that may be a big part of it. I think is people just a massive amount of biblical illiteracy. So much more so these days than the way it used to be when I grew up, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when people aren't actively studying their Bible, they're losing context. And as I'm fond of saying, context is theology. Mm-hmm. If you don't have the language and the culture and all the little minutia in place, you strip whatever happens to be being preached on or teached on, you strip it of its basic theology, or the theology that was intended. Mm-hmm. And I hear from Sunday school teachers a lot about, I can't believe that nobody's studying their Sunday school lesson, and these are people who've claimed to be Christians for decades, and they still don't read their Bible regularly or study their lessons. And we're reaping the harvest of all this that's been planted in the church.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that in effect that they're creating sort of a new Christian breed of witchcraft?
Yeah, I think you could call it that. I read somewhere that I can't remember the commentator, but it was really clever. That we've turned Jesus into a life coach. And there's the psychology angle for you there.
Yeah.
And Christianity has become this kind of morally therapeutic deism. Where you might believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or you might not. Maybe Jesus was just a great teacher. Disturbingly, you see more and more of that also, particularly in Protestant evangelical circles.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that I'm not saying that the Roman Catholic Church doesn't have its own problems, but how is it that the Roman Catholic Church can recognize that demonic oppression and possession is on the rise, so they're training more exorcists, but the Protestant evangelical church seems to be asleep at the wheel when it comes to stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, of course, that's what's in Hollywood all the time, is like Hollywood's primary version of Christianity is Catholicism. And whenever they show any kind of measure of Protestants, it's usually the snake handlers and the weirdos, and he's the primary antagonist of the show because he's a Fruit Loop or something. So Protestants are typically not well depicted in standard Hollywood.
It's the Bible says. The Bible says, guy.
Right? The Bible says. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the Catholic Church. We're going to break. Well, we'll talk some more when we come back.
Extendivite, a 7-herb combination made from garlic, cayenne, hawthorn, bilberry, ginkgo biloba, valerian, and milk thistle. Extendivite feeds our body with the right nutrients to keep us healthy. Just listen to what Arthur has to say.
I was just calling to tell you what a great product you have. I had used this about 10 years ago after I had congestive heart failure. And it fixed me up and got me going for the last 10 years. Lately, I've been having heart trouble again, so I placed another order because this was the only thing that ever worked. And I just wanted to let you know that you have a great product.
To order, call 1-877-928-8822. That's 1-877-928-8822, or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendovite.
So, you love talk radio? Then you'll love TalkStreamLive.com. TalkStream Live is always on, 24/7, with the best streaming talk shows. Find your favorite talkers and discover some new ones. It's free, readily available online or on mobile with any smartphone or tablet. Finding your favorite talk shows all in one place has gotten a whole lot easier. Just go to TalkStreamLive.com. Be sure to download the free apps from Google Play or the iTunes App Store.
If you have hard water, the Lime Scale not only leaves white spots, it clogs pipes and breaks down appliances, costing you hundreds of dollars in energy and wear. Eliminate Lime Scale and other water issues like brown staining and bad odors with HydroCare water products, available from Wave Home Solutions. Wave's affordable water systems don't use salts or chemicals. You'll love the way your water tastes, smells, and looks. Satisfaction guaranteed. For more information, go to bestwater123.com. That's bestwater123.com.
More than a dozen astronauts have officially reported UFOs. Hundreds of hours of UFO footage were filmed by astronauts aboard the space shuttle. Many of these UFOs can only be seen in ultraviolet light. Retired former Apollo astronauts and cosmonauts now tell their stories of their own personal UFO encounters.
The Enigma Channel, intelligent television for planet Earth. EnigmaTV.com.
No hate, no hype, no fear. We are TFR, your protection from deception.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba, and this evening I'm talking with my guest, Dr. Judd Burton, and we are talking about witchcraft. And right before the break, we were talking about the Catholic Church, and of course, growing up Baptist, as a independent, fundamental King James only Baptist that I grew. They were quick to point out we weren't Protestants. We were around before the Protestants, so we weren't even Protestants. We were outside of that. But in that environment, of course, I grew up in New England, where it's predominantly Catholic. We're taught about all the evils of Catholicism, and pretty much every Christian denomination is pointing fingers at the other one. Frankly, I don't think there's any of them that are perfect. I think there's problems with all of them. But I can say this about the Catholic Church, and that is that they certainly do seem to be the dominant Christian denomination that is known for still the practice of exorcism. But what's your take on that? I mean, do you think, I don't want to point fingers and say somebody's not really in a relationship with Christ, just because of denominational bias. I mean, I'm not going to say it's all fraudulent. But it does certainly appear to be, and maybe it's just simply the fact that there's power in the name of Jesus, and these guys are walking in some measure of faith to do it. But what's your take on sort of the Catholic version of exorcism?
Well, I think a lot of it is I mean, it's so much liturgy and rite and mechanical, to an extent. But there have been individuals, exorcist in the Catholic Church who clearly had a relationship with Jesus. I think about Malachi Martin strikes me as one of those people. I think that in fact I think he had an insight into some of the breakdown in the Catholic Church, and a lot of that takes place after the Second Vatican Council in 1962, which basically strips away all the classical elements of Roman Catholicism and infused it with socialism and postmodernism.
Right.
But there were a handful of holdouts and classicists, and even to this day there are offshoots of the Roman Catholic Church that are
anti-Vatican.
They're not part of the infrastructure. They're not under the authority of Rome. The one that comes to mind is the autocephalic Catholic Church in Western Europe, and a lot of these people have deliverance ministries. They're heavily invested in this kind of work, and feel that they're called to do it. So I think that there are. There have been certainly legitimate, Jesus following, Jesus loving exorcists within the Catholic Church, but a lot of it is so mechanical that there is power in the name of Jesus, and we can talk about the power of the Word in a moment, both in Christianity, both in our belief system and in witchcraft. The power of life and death is in the tongue, as the scriptures say. That's not just hyperbole. And so, I think that there have been legitimate exorcists within the Catholic Church. We see the liturgy and rite is as simply a deliverance tool, not the deliverance itself, not what happens before and after. That's a whole other ministerial calculus that they have to take into account. But like I say, I don't think that's universal. I think, in some cases, and my fear is that a lot of the exorcists that are being trained now is just sort of in cookie cutter fashion. I may be wrong about that, but again, to drive the point home, it's really shocking that the Catholic Church can recognize this, maybe not necessarily from the complete top down. We already know we know how corrupt the administration is within the Catholic Church. The current Pope isn't even supposed to be Pope by his own order's rules. The Jesuits aren't supposed to take those kinds of offices, so that ought to tell you something. But how members of clergy within the Catholic Church and sort of their middling officers, cardinals and bishops, can recognize the need, and evangelicals, Protestants, people of Christians of all creed and color, largely don't recognize the need for it because so many of them have stopped believing in a supernatural worldview.
Yeah, I would agree that a lot of it is rote. It's just kind of do this, do that. But what I found in my own quest for truth and understanding the gifts of the Spirit is that somebody just has to have faith. Somebody. Whether it's the victim or the practitioner, somewhere in the mix that because even if you think of Yeshua, Jesus Christ himself, no one had more faith than him, right? I mean, clearly, right? But yet even he was restricted in what he was able to do in his hometown because of their unbelief. So you have the most powerful entity that ever walked this earth as a human being was restricted in what he could do because of their unbelief. So I always say doubt is the kryptonite of faith, right? I mean, you either have faith or you have doubt, and if you're walking in some measure of faith combined with the power in the name of Jesus or Yeshua, then you're going to see things happen. So it may be that the practitioners of exorcism and stuff like that, even though maybe it's just kind of rote and these are do this, do that, and it's formulaic, someone in there is having a measure of faith for these demons to be cast out.
Certainly. Yeah, that component has to be in there. It's obligatory. And while we talk about the more or less formal training of exorcists, whether they be priests in the Catholic Church or they're deliverance ministers, amongst evangelicals and Protestants, we're all called to some degree or another to do this. If the occasion arises where we can help somebody,
do it.
We're all given authority in the name of Jesus to do that, because when you consider, between a third and a half of what Jesus did in his ministry involved helping demonized people, helping to extract those influences from them. And again, it wasn't hyperbole for him to say that you'll do these things and greater. We have to remember that that's part of our calling.
Yeah, for sure.
You can always be a more, and I get it. There are people who are called directly to that life, and that makes up the bulk of their ministry. And you can always be a more informed demonologist, certainly. That's never going to be a crutch to people, studying the history and culture of witchcraft. That's why I offer these classes, for people to take on these subjects, is so that you can get a better sense of the literature of the topic, and where some of the big work has been done, or some of the strides forward. And it's a mixed bag, because it's not always a document search. Witches typically don't keep written records, or if they do, they keep them very secret. And so it involves the study of oral tradition and lore and folklore, Yeah, even relying on archaeology in some cases to pick up little details about how these people practice their craft, as it were.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I mean, in basic training in the military, we had what they called our SMART book, or Common Soldier's Task Book, and whenever we had idle time, which you pretty much never do, but if you did, you should be, they basically said if you have idle time, you need to be reading your Common Soldier's Task Book. So it was always in our cargo pant pocket, right, that you had to be reading it. And so the idea being that every soldier has the same group of common tasks that we all have to be able to perform, whether it's a basic medical care for a wounded soldier or whatever. I mean, you have to have the basics of first aid down. Now there'll be people who will be specifically trained to be field medics. They will know a lot more, but we have to be able to do basic triage in a combat situation, or be able to any number of basic things. And essentially what you were saying earlier is, like, every Christian has a commission to have the basic understanding, at least, of all of these things. Heal the sick, cleanse the leper, cast out demons. These are all part of the commission that we're supposed to do. But there will be people who are specialized in that, just like a combat field medic would be specialized, or mechanic, or what have you. After boot camp, we go to Advanced Individual Training School, AIT, and that's when we get our specialized training skills. So that's the way I would look at people, like a Greg Reed or something. Some of these guys that are specialized in dealing with satanic ritual abuse, or dealing with witchcraft and things of that nature. But all of us in a moment should be able, if we are confronted with somebody who's possessed or who's in need of healing or whatever, should be ready, especially if you hear the prompting or feel the prompting of the Holy Spirit to move and act. Then we should do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you think
so go ahead,
before I change the subject.
Go ahead.
So I was going to ask, do you think that the current, right now there's a big push for disclosure, aliens, UFOs, all this stuff we're seeing in the news, and rumblings that something may happen in the near future, probably, in that regard. Do you think that the current UFO, alien abduction, close encounters of the third, fourth, and fifth kind are just repackaged witchcraft in a modern context? I think of the work of Joe Jordan, who I interviewed a few weeks ago, and his research, and realizing, even with working with MUFON, that you want to stop alien abductions, invoke the name of Jesus. Guess what? It works.
Yeah, he's done some really good quantitative work in that regard, and it's really impressive. And so to a degree, even the more materialistic minded UFO researchers over the years, some of them have actually come forward and written about how these encounters resemble encounters with what people would have called demons in past ages. I think of Jacques Vallée. He's the guy that comes to my mind, first. Who's just a powerhouse in the field of ufology. And if you got him writing about it, in that context, and I think that has to prompt a question. Is there a supernatural facet to what's going on? And then when you throw in all the other stuff about the accounts of people saying, well, they're always talking about Jesus. They're not talking about Muhammad or Krishna or Zoroaster or any of these other guys. They're always talking about Jesus. Well, that's odd, but it's not odd in a peripherally interesting kind of a way. There should be a matter of compulsion. It should be compelling. No matter what somebody's worldview is. Why are these things constantly asking about, giving a different version of, or flat out denigrating Jesus in these encounters? And let's not forget that a lot of these encounters are traumatic for people. They're physically and emotionally traumatic because of what's being done to them. And this, while on the surface, there may be, these may be, genetic genetic sorts of tests, because we get all kinds of tales about, sperm and ova, being removed and taken, and
Yeah.
people getting pregnant, and having babies as a result of these procedures. But I'm of the belief that they're also to create this trauma in the same way that satanic ritual abuse creates trauma, and that's how their victims become so manipulable. If you talk to deliverance ministers who deal with this, and even people who have been in it and have, God has rescued them out of it. That you hear this story over and over again about the being abused and traumatized, and it's to create terror and panic because these entities feed on that
fear. Yeah, that's, having experienced shadow people myself. I've had, unfortunately, had a number of experiences with them. If anybody who has had experiences with shadow people and/or so-called alien abductions, you very quickly realize that fear is their food, and I certainly believe and have, in many times, invoked the name of Jesus to get rid of them. But there was another time where I didn't do that, and it was at a time when I was feeling, frankly, suicidal, and when it happened, I was like, fine, okay, if you get it over with. Like, I didn't care, and they left. They left. It was like, when I wasn't giving them the fear, they left. So, while I certainly would advocate for the invoking of the name of Yeshua or Jesus to cast them out, in my personal experience, I also realized that fear it feeds them, and the lack of fear, they'll go eat somewhere else if you're not giving them fear to eat.
Right. Yeah. That sheds so much light on how time and time again in the Gospels and even the epistles in the New Testament, they encourage us not to have fear. God doesn't give us a spirit of fear. And again, that's not just saying something, that's the authors of those books weren't just sitting around thinking, gee, what literary device can I use to illustrate this? How can I be poetic? It's not hyperbolic. It's not metaphorical.
Mm-hmm.
There's a practical, rubber meets the road kind of application, in terms of supernatural worldview where that's concerned.
So, speaking of supernatural worldview, what could you give us as some biblical perspectives on witchcraft?
Well, certainly the biblical world was, it was also peopled by what we would today call witches. These people that operate on the periphery. Probably in the Old Testament, one of the more famous
Witch of Endor
was the Witch of Endor, and
with the Ewoks.
She was, well, not the Ewoks.
I know.
She was representative of these sort of rogue Canaanite and Phoenician priestesses who sort of wandered about in almost a kind of gypsy fashion. I'm not denigrating the Roma ethnicity, but using the term generally, they offered their services, which involved typically necromancy, the casting of hexes and spells, the preparation of potions and poisons, and of course in that passage there in I think it's in 1st or 2nd Samuel, about the Witch of Endor, where Saul consults her.
That's a freaky story, man.
Yeah, it is freaky. Necromancy is at the communication with the dead is at the heart of that entire encounter.
Yeah, for sure.
In the New Testament, the same is very true. I just finished a script for one of my Quick Classics videos, and this week's is going to be on the goddess Hecate in Greek mythology, who was a goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. and she was certainly not a central deity. She was a chthonic underworld deity who sort of mediated between the world of the Titans and the world of the Olympians. But she was revered in places like Athens and Thessaly, and in a number of places in Anatolia, like Phrygia, in the Greco-Roman world, until very late. We're talking late antiquity, 5th century, 6th century kind of stuff. And then she went underground, like a lot of the old classical pagan deities did in the Mediterranean world. But like I said, the word for sorcery that's used in the New Testament is pharmakeia, and you see the same sort of template for this kind of practitioner showing up.
Yeah, so you mentioned pharmakeia. There's an awful lot of that going around these days. I mean, if we take that literally from a biblical perspective, I mean, right now, every day in the news, we're being inundated with witchcraft, if we go by the pharmakeia side of things.
Yeah.
So do you think that there's like a worldwide spell being cast on everybody right now?
I think that's something that doesn't stop. I think that's on a loop. I mean, we know how, whatever appellation people want to put, to this secretive group, these globalists, Illuminati, they're Luciferians, they're compartmentalized, but they all subscribe, to the same satanic worldview, and so many of these people are in positions of power that they use advertising and symbolism in the way that where did they learn how to do this stuff? Well, a lot of it goes back to our shadow organizations like the CIA and stuff like MK Ultra that I'm sure a lot of your audience will be familiar with. They were, they called it psychological warfare, but it was flat out witchcraft. Mm-hmm. It was a manipulation of awareness. Like I said, it was the bending of natural law for some sort of objective. And so I think we're just, pop culture is the medium through which that bullet is fired, and we're constantly being bombarded by it.
Going back to the biblical side of things, I've always been intrigued and confused by Solomon, and especially when you get into the Goetica and his controlling of the 70 demons, and supposedly had the power ring that he could control demons. And I mean, did he get involved in some sort of what we might consider today white witchcraft, or did he go over to the dark side? Was he playing on both sides? I mean, it gets really convoluted when you read both the scriptural account of what happened with Solomon, and then you get into the occult side of things, and why the Illuminati and the Freemasons and everybody loved Solomon so much, and everything that he was doing with the 70 demons. And when you see even the Temple of Solomon, when I'm reading, was it 1 Kings 9, I think it is, and it says that he had conscripted the Canaanites that Joshua had failed to, and his father David had failed to get rid of. I'm like, what? Nephilim built the temple? What?
Yeah.
And they're bringing 666 talents of gold a year to build this thing. I'm what? I'm like, so I mean, we got 3 minutes before the break, but we'll pick up after the break also. But yeah, what's your take on Solomon as it pertains to witchcraft?
Well, that's
a pretty loaded question.
That is it is, but I was going to say that's a bit of a Gordian knot. It's hard to sift through. If you look at the the apocryphal side of things, it's not outside the realm of possibility and even probability. And then when you read Solomon's own writings in the Old Testament, it's you certainly get the intimation that he backslid, and that he was corrupted to a degree by a number of the wives that he married, and he clearly lamented and regretted. I think he repented.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Ecclesiastes
But
would
he,
tend to make
you know,
believe that.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly. I was just about to say Ecclesiastes. You read that, and you can feel, what it did to him, and the regret that he had.
But it would seem prior to that, especially if you read some of the extra biblical accounts of what he was supposedly able to do with that ring and controlling demons, that he had to have walked in some form of euphoric power. I have the power. Like that had to have been extremely addicting for him. Prior to him finally, I think I would agree with you that he had a time of waking up in repentance. But prior to that, man, he must have gone down a pretty serious slope.
Yeah, and there's so much about Solomon's, really the middle of Solomon's life, that we just don't know about. We get generalities from the scripture, and maybe we're maybe not supposed to know the complete picture there. But
yeah, probably.
My sense of it is that he was wise enough, he was knowledgeable and gifted enough to be able to do those things, and his wisdom eventually kicked in, and he was convicted about it, and perhaps could even see the ramifications of his actions, because it's after Solomon that Israel and Judah divide into two kingdoms. Mm-hmm. And of course it's not long after that the Assyrians attack the northern kingdom, and then
that's it. Yep. All right, we'll be back when we come back from the break.
Truth Frequency Radio is your #1 source for news and information without the hate, hype, and fear. We're proud to feature cutting-edge programs like The Christopher Everard Show, The Covert Report with Susan Lindauer, Enemy Within Radio with Tom Barnes, Freaky Friday with The Woo Crew, The Gematria Effect with Zachary Hubbard, America's Evil Genius with Travis Cook, Phoenix Rising Radio with Phoenix, Quantum Connections with Lucky, and dozens more. Did you know you can listen from any telephone by dialing 641-793-7117 or call into your favorite show toll free at 833-TFR-LIVE. Uncensored talk and news you won't hear in the mainstream media. Truth Frequency Radio, your protection from deception.
Mass shooting victims identified. I'm Jack Callahan, Fox News.
What the hell's going on in the United States of America? What the hell's wrong with us?
California's Governor Gavin Newsom reacting to the mass shootings at a rail yard in San Jose, California that left 8 people dead.
The shooting happened during a morning shift change, and officers arrived to find multiple victims in several buildings, including the gunman who appears to have killed himself. 57-year-old Sam Cassidy worked at the transit agency since 2012.
Fox's Claudia Cowan reports Cassidy's ex-wife says he would talk about killing people at work, but she never believed him. The Santa Clara County Coroner's Office says the victims range in age from 29 to 63. President Biden issuing a statement calling again on Congress, as he put it, to help end this epidemic of gun violence in America. The president is also giving the country's intelligence community 90 days to report on the origins of the coronavirus. But Missouri Republican Senator Josh Hawley says there's no reason to wait 3 more months. He's written a bill to make existing intelligence on the virus public.
They have done all kinds of assessments. They've done research. They've reached some conclusions, or at least they've got some ideas. I think the American people deserve to see that intelligence. I mean, why should we take Joe Biden's word for it? We ought to be able to see for ourselves, and that's what my legislation would do.
In light of the new investigation, Facebook says it will stop banning posts that suggest the coronavirus is man-made. U.S. and Chinese trade envoys have spoken by phone for the first time since President Biden took office, neither side saying when actual negotiations on ending the tariff war might restart. Utah Senator Mitt Romney has accepted the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award for being the only Republican to vote to convict former President Trump during his first impeachment. Romney says there's plenty of blame to go around for the nation's political chasm. Wall Street Wednesday, the Dow up 10 points, NASDAQ gained 80, the S&P 500 closing 7 points higher. America is listening to Fox News.
Into the truth frequency. Your protection from deception. This is Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba, and we're going into the second hour of the broadcast, and I'm joined with my guest, Dr. Judd Burton. And right before the break, we were talking about Solomon in the Old Testament, King Solomon. I mean, he really was like, he's the Old Testament representation of a prodigal son. It seems like. I mean, like you said, there seems to be a period of time in the middle of his life, if we accept that Ecclesiastes was written at the end of his life, which it appears to be, because he's looking back and everything's vanity and everything, and he's sort of, waxing eloquent on, giving all these little fortune cookie type of one-liners about, what he's kind of learned in the failures of his life and things like that. But I mean, it seems like in the period of time where we're not really given much information about him in the Bible, but you find in other texts certainly, that he went way off into the deep end and probably started the beginning of what eventually would become, I would imagine, Kabbalah. Because it was interesting to me that when I first took the red pill, so to speak, and I used to do field trips to Washington D.C. a lot when I lived in Massachusetts. It was like an 8-hour train ride, go down there, do visit the mall and everything. But when you're on the blue pill, you don't see anything. You just see pretty monuments. Yeah. But you take the red pill and you're like, what? This place is like evil to the core, everywhere you look. And I went inside the George Washington Masonic Temple. And man, it's like Hebrew. Like there's Hebrew everywhere, You're like, yeah. There's like this disconnect because if you come from a Judeo-Christian background and you understand things like witchcraft and things that are the dark side of things, and when you look into Freemasonry and Illuminati and the Rosicrucians and all that kind of secret society type of stuff, and then you see it all kind of blended together. Like there's so much of this Hebrew mysticism that is wrapped up in modern occult stuff and Kabbalah and things like that. You've written something about a primordial witch. What's that all about, and is it tied into this? Does it have, at least in a modern context, does it have a Hebrew foundation through the likes of Solomon, or what's your take on all of that, and why are they so obsessed with Hebrew type of stuff within the occult?
Well, the primal witch, I think, is what you're referring to. But it's the same sort of concept. Yeah, one of the chapters in Interview with the Giant, and it's a topic that I've expounded on since then, is the primal witch, and this is that. It harkens back to the definition that I gave at the beginning of the show, that these are the model for this sort of witchcraft, for this sort of direct demonic tutelage, actually comes from the pre-flood world, and we read about it in works, apocryphal works, especially like Enoch, that give us a more detailed account of what's going on in Genesis 6, where the Benach Elohim, the Watchers, the sons of God, are teaching humanity in exchange for genetic access, are teaching him this mixture of practical sciences and occult knowledge, and in effect, the mothers of the Nephilim were the first witches of this sort. And I'm not saying that witchcraft didn't exist before this in other societies in prehistory, but this is the model that I'm talking about. That's why I call it the primal witch, because you're right, it does harken back to a primordial, primeval time, in this case, biblical prehistory, in the wake of the Watcher incursion before the flood. And this is drawn, this is the basis for, this makes the basis for Luciferian witchcraft as well, which is in some circles is mixed with thaumaturgy or high magic, and you see it in a lot of the symbolism and the sigils. You ask the question as to why Hebrew is such a factor here. Well, it's like everything that the demonic does. It takes what God gives and turns it on its head, makes a counterfeit of it. It makes a blurry opposite facsimile of what God gives, and this sort of bastardization of Hebrew, I think, is a good example of that. As you were talking, the symbol that came to mind was the Baphomet symbol, because around the circumference of the Baphomet are Hebrew letters, and interestingly enough, they spell out Leviathan, which in effect makes an Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, in this case Leviathan, around the Baphomet symbol. And I think that has, because this is research that's current on my mind, I think that this has ramifications for Genesis chapter 3 and the prophecy in verse 15 about the serpent's seed, because the Ouroboros is also a symbol of reproduction and regeneration, and in the Ouroboros, the snake's tail is a phallic symbol and the mouth is a stylized womb.
Interesting.
And so these kinds of symbols that have rooting in the use of Hebrew words are indicative of this kind of demonic misuse of things that God gives, the things that God's present. He presents a good chunk of his message to the world in Hebrew.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, that everything within the demonic is going to be, of course, that's Lucifer. And I hesitate to even use the word Lucifer, because I know that that's a made-up word pulled from the margin of Jerome into the text, but for the sake of understanding Satan, if you will, the serpent, the dragon, as an entity that people are familiar with, that the demonic and the Luciferian is a counterfeit of everything of God, and we know that when it comes to Yahuwah, it's Hebrew, the Hebrew people. So makes kind of sense that's why it would show up as a counterfeit. But it seems to me like, especially when you start looking into some of the stuff that Chuck Missler was known for studying, and other things like the Bible codes and stuff like that especially in the ancient Hebrew, the power just in not just the spoken word, but in the written word, in the gematria, if you will, of the written word itself, that as a language, it seems to have tremendous power, which could be used either for good or, as we're talking about here, for evil, which would be why it would seem that it would be the go-to language for them.
Yes, and I think that to an extent that's true of the classical languages, Greek and Latin too. I've wondered for years why so much of satanic ritual magic was done in Latin. And it occurred to me that Satan played a role in the maneuvering and machinations of the rise of the Roman Empire, and it was the Roman Empire that he used as a tool, to try and put an end to Jesus. In a general way, through the territorial peregrine law that the Romans convicted Jesus by.
Oh, that's
interesting. Of course, there's a whole culture and language behind it, and because it remains such a part of Western culture for so many centuries, it makes sense that was one of the reasons why it did so. Not just because it was the language of the Western Church, but you know, to me that's a pretty substantive explanation of why Latin and Hebrew, for that matter, you find in a lot of this thaumaturgy, high magic ritual and Satanism.
I never made that connection. That's interesting about Latin, because I think
classical. We in education, a lot of people, even if they had a basic education, there were still classical methods, that were taught in public school, up until recent decades. Say 20, 30, 40 years ago. When people still had some conversancy in the classics, they might get a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Greek. You even got, classical authors and some mythology, so that you were conversant in that world to an extent. But and particularly when it was married to Christian, classical Christian education, in the vein of the Irish system and Charlemagne's palace schools under Alcuin, that remained part of even public education for centuries after that. But we don't have that anymore. We've jettisoned classical education married to Christian education completely. First with the likes of John Dewey. And then gradually over recent decades, we've seen with the increase in standardized testing and postmodernism, it's just completely gutted education and ripped all the substance out of it. And so people don't it's hard sometimes to pick up on those kinds of connections, because we've unfortunately we sort of cut our own throats in terms of our education by getting rid of the old classical methods.
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck on something that you said, regarding Latin. Yeah, I guess when I maybe it could just be ignorance on my part, but when I think of Latin, I think of Latino. When I think of Latino, I think of Spanish. So I equate Latin with Spain rather than Rome, which I would equate with Italian. But in the context of the Romans in the Bible, I equate to Greek. but it would have been, but Latin would have been, I guess, probably the dominant among the Romans. Would that be?
Yeah, it was certainly the language of the state, and so in consular circles and the provincial governorships. Amongst the soldiery, of course, Latin is going to be the language that was spoken. Now, Greek was still the lingua franca, and a lot of people, in the church age did speak the Koine Greek. That whether people were traders or involved in maritime trade or things like that, that's why so much of the New Testament ends up being written in Koine, because that was the wider audience, the Gentile audience that they were talking to. But Latin was certainly the language of the Roman state.
So, wow, that's so interesting, because we're talking about witchcraft, we're talking about pharmakia being witchcraft, and Latin being the language of pharmakia, or modern quote unquote science. I mean, it's the language of science today, and the language of pharmakia. So, wow. So, I mean, was that adopted within the occult, perhaps because it was the dominant language of the state that killed Christ?
Well, I think that's part of it, particularly in the more secretive, Illuminized circles, if you want to call them that. The power players that shaped, in particular, the Western world, but also we have to remember that as we get into the 1500s, 1600s, the early modern era, there are global aspirations at work here too. So, and not to mention that Latin was also the, whereas Greek, the Koine was the lingua franca, but Greek was also the language. It was the language of scholarship in the Greco-Roman era. That changed to Latin, about the time that late antiquity starts. So, and it continued into the 18th and 19th centuries, and most people who were educated were pretty conversant in it, and so people from different countries could correspond in Latin. So in certain circles, those upper echelons of society, it was certainly still being used. And I have an inkling suspicion that even to this day, is still being used.
Well, yeah, it was, as I was, they say in filmmaking, nothing's written, everything's rewritten. So you're constantly right to the moment you start shooting, you're rewriting. It's only set in stone after it's in the can and been edited into the final version of whatever you're doing. So as I've done many different iterations of the scripts over the years, the thought has occurred to me and has been suggested to me on a number of occasions by different people when I have certain characters that are on the antagonist side, saying or doing something on the kind of in the secretive sort of way, has been suggested to me on a number of occasions. You should have them say that line in Latin. And I was like, "Ooh, yeah, that's a good idea." It adds that little bit of intrigue to it, because it seems to be, growing up, being taught, well, Latin's a dead language, and yet it's all around us, especially in the sciences and in the occult and in the Catholic Church.
It's a dead language insofar as that it's classical Latin may not be spoken conversantly, but even English. Although it's a Germanic language, in its origins and its structure, it was thoroughly Latinized after the Norman conquest. After the Normans brought French to England, and so a good 2/5, half of the English language is Latin and Greek. Just by proxy, and that's true of a lot of languages too, and certainly the Romance languages that sprang from Latin, Spanish and Catalan and Portuguese and French, what have you.
So it would be your take then that some of those other languages like Spanish and Portuguese and stuff would be later derivatives from a pure form of Latin before that?
Yeah, because you can. It doesn't take a linguist. I mean, you can look at these words and see the morphemic and phonemic similarities, the way that the words are structured and the way that they sound, descending from their Latin roots. But in the wake of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, all of that territory basically was divided up amongst the indigenous population of Europe at the time, and a lot of those Latin was very much present. There was still a lingering Roman culture, but it was syncretistic. It melded with the indigenous cultures and their languages there, and so you have different basically Latin develops into these different languages in different places in Europe. So in the Iberian Peninsula, it becomes Spanish and Portuguese and Catalan, and in Gaul it becomes French, and so on and so forth.
So it's been a while since I've studied this. You have the Hebrew version. Certainly, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The first Targum is a Hebrew word for translation, was in Aramaic. And then 100, 200 years or so after that, you had the translation into Greek with the Septuagint. And it would seem to me that that's what it was: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek until Jerome, and then we get Latin,
Mm-hmm.
and then sometime later we finally get English. So I've never spent any time thinking about it till this conversation. That's why I love talking with you, Judd. We always kind of spin off on these interesting dialogues, and it really gets me thinking of things. But I'm kind of running with the idea right now is that the other side is taking and twisting and perverting the things of God. So the witchcraft, the demonic side, is taking the language of God, the Hebrew, and perverting it. And then you have the language of the state, the kind of the official, the uppity ups, the hierarchy of the state that killed Christ, speaking Latin. So you could see why, because why else? Why of all the languages in the world, why is the occult primarily, at least in pop culture anyway? That's what you always see, that they are either doing some kind of thing with a perversion of Hebrew through Kabbalistic type of means, and or Latin, and the Catholic Church maintaining Latin liturgy, and even doing many of their casting out of demons stuff with Dominus Ominous, blah blah blah, with the doing it in Latin.
So there aren't a whole lot of people that do that too. After that was one of the things that sort of got canned, was the Latin reading of the liturgy and the rites in Latin after the Second Vatican Council that I mentioned a moment ago.
Yeah, well, I was invited. It was invite only kind of thing to Mel Gibson's church a number of years ago.
Okay.
And his dad is like hardcore anti-Vatican II, and like there's a whole, like they have their own sort of branch of Catholicism, but the whole thing was in Latin.
For good reason. When you look into it, like I said, it's basically infusing the Catholic Church with socialism and postmodernism.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Wow. So you think that based on what you were saying earlier, then witchcraft itself has antediluvian origins going all the way back to the what I call the Genesis 6 experiment, the activity of the Watchers. And of course, if you look at in the Book of Enoch, and it talks about there's several characters that are named specifically in the Book of Enoch, and they're named in association with the things that they taught men to do. And would you say that was the origin of antediluvian witchcraft, is the teaching of the Watchers that we read about in the Book of Enoch?
Yes, I do. And it's interesting that you reference that there are specific ones. Azazel is an interesting character in this story because, for people who are familiar with the Enoch narrative, we know that he's, in the judgment that God hands down that Enoch, pronounces on the Watchers, he's seen as the most culpable for revealing the mysteries of heaven. And so there's a he's one of the main instigators in the passing on of what we know of as witchcraft.
You mentioned Baphomet specifically earlier, and we see that character in iconography certainly show up a lot within the occult and stuff. So do you think, and actually somebody had asked this in the chat room, they said, what are your thoughts on the hidden in plain sight androgyny in elite circles? It's not just elite circles now, it's being pushed on our kids. This whole gender's a spectrum thing. It's like, no, gender's determined by what's between your legs, not what's between your ears. If you're confused up here, get this fixed. You don't need to be, for thousands of years, regardless of race, color, creed, religion, culture, no one had a problem with this. Baby pops out, something dangling down there, hey, it's a boy, right? But
it's all X and Y chromosomes. I saw a panel one time of these people weren't even believers. I don't even think they subscribed to a worldview beyond the materialistic, but it was an evolutionary biologist, a medical doctor, and a neurobiologist, I think. And they were talking about, the topic was gender fluidity, and they all shot it down just on the basis of their own training. That there are only two biological genders, and all of the transgender people in the audience just went crazy, just complete meltdown sort of thing.
So, but do you think it's a spell?
Yeah,
do you think that we're under a Baphomet spell right now that's trying to create this androgyny? That, why? I mean, why else is this happening? I mean, I think that there's certainly some chemical reasons for it. I believe. I think, baby formula being full of soy, and you're feeding a baby boy soy. Estrogen, things like that. I think that there are chemical reasons that can create imbalances like that, but I think all of this is deliberate. So do you think that there is a Baphomet spell being cast on society to create this whole... I mean, this was not an issue, 10 years ago? Now it's everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere you look. Even family members and friends and people are confused about this issue now all of a sudden. It's like it...
Well, I mean, like I said before, we're constantly bombarded by it, through media and through pop culture. This is just one of the latest iterations, and really, in its conceptualization, not even a late blooming plan. God told people to be fruitful and multiply. Well, right. Again, what does the demonic do? They're gonna push the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. They're gonna corrupt and blur, God's plan, and this is part of it. But there were people like George Orwell, who wrote about it in 1984. I think even H.G. Wells, who was a futurist himself and part of the Fabian Society. And notably, Aldous Huxley.
Hold that thought.
And,
we'll talk about that when we come back from the break. Yep.
From the dawn of man, we have turned to nature to help attain balance within ourselves. But somewhere, we lost our way. Western culture is once again remembering the healing benefits of CBD, the non-psychoactive component of the hemp plant. That's why more and more people who use CBD report relief from inflammation and chronic pain, balanced blood sugar and cardiovascular system, relief from muscle tensions, tremors, migraines, headaches, anxiety, depression, and the list goes on. The big question is, where do you get it? Life is a 99% pure CBD oil made with all organic ingredients, and it's available to TFR listeners worldwide. If you use coupon code TFR at checkout, you'll get $5 towards your order. Head on over to ialife.com now. That's AYA-life.com.
Balance of Nature's fruits and veggies in a capsule.
It's a great product. And the one thing I like about it the most is that when you open the bottles, you can smell like the scent of the fruits and veggies. It's no genius thing to it. It's really just fruits and veggies, which everyone needs. And you guys kind of put it in a way where you can take it easy and you can get it, and it's natural, and that's what I like about it. I like the product, and I've taken it, and it's definitely made me feel a lot better. I'm a healthy person to begin with, but it's definitely good prevention, and it's definitely gives me energy, and I feel like it's a natural thing. I like it. I really do.
For a limited time, use discount code TALK to receive a 50% discount on your first preferred whole health system and have it shipped to you free. Call 1-800-246-8751 or go online to balanceofnature.com. Again, use discount code TALK.
Jacob Frank Leibovich is the mastermind behind a global network of satanic cults. He taught that the creator God was evil. Jacob Frank proclaimed himself as the true Messiah. He vowed never to tell the truth. He rejected every moral law and declared that the only way to a new society was through the total destruction of civilization. Murder, rape, incest, and the drinking of blood were perfectly acceptable actions and rituals. His followers established the Marxist system and have infiltrated Islam and Judaism. He was the Messiah of the Illuminati.
EnigmaTV.com.
Real people, real radio. Wherever you are, make it TFR. Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba, and we're going into the final half-hour segment of the broadcast. I'm talking with my guest, Dr. Judd Burton. And it's funny you're mentioning H.G. Wells, Orwell, and Huxley right before we went to break. That YouTube channel I mentioned earlier, Academy of Ideas, several videos talked about them. The ones I was watching was called The Manufacturing of Mass Psychosis. Can Sanity Return to an Insane World was one of them. Then the other one was George Orwell in 1984, How Freedom Dies. Then Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, The Dark Side of Pleasure. And then How to Be Free in an Unfree World. And the other video, the last one that I posted, was Why Public Schools and the Mainstream Media Dumb Us Down. And dealt very much with the writings of, specifically of Orwell, and Huxley, and talking about 1984 and Brave New World and all that. So you got cut off there by the break, so I'll let you finish your thought on regarding them.
I think I've been talking about. I think I ended on Aldous Huxley. He was an interesting figure. His brother Julian Huxley was heavily involved in the UN. At one point, I think he was in the administrative side of the UN. And Aldous Huxley came back in the wake. It was in the wake of writing the follow-up to Brave New World, and said, "Yeah, this is all in the works. This is the plan. I wrote it into literature." And it's interesting. It doesn't really, it doesn't stop there. In the literary cycles. I told you in an email I'm a longtime Frank Herbert fan, of Dune.
Yeah.
Even the backstory to Dune involves elements of this, humanity becoming apathetic, and basically the sex act had stopped, and they were creating humans artificially, and the machines and artificial intelligence took over, so they became so enamored with what they had accomplished, what they thought was progress. That's an interesting word that's used these days. What they thought was progress ended up, destroying their civilization. Mm-hmm. People, there are still authors that still write about it, not just in a prognosticative way, but all these books should be cautionary tales for us. And yet, our policymakers, particularly now, are ramming this stuff down our throats as if it were fact. You mentioned gender fluidity and transgenderism. That goes for transhumanism and what people want to do. What these people in power want to do, what they consider the next step in human evolution, is the combination of the organic and the synthetic, and then going beyond that. This was such a crime in I mentioned Dune a moment ago. In the backstory, this revolt that humans eventually had to undertake against the machines, what they call thinking machines, the AI. This in the wake of all of that, this was considered such a crime that artificial intelligence was a capital offense.
Wow, I never. My parents loved Dune, and I have a lot of friends and stuff, and you also that have always talked very highly about Dune. I never really got into it with the old one that came out. That was who was in that? Was it Sting? Was Sting in that? Or
Sting, yeah, I got the David Lynch the adaptation,
the original one. I never really got into that one, but I've been hearing a lot of interesting stuff about the new adaptation. That's is it out?
Yeah,
is it out now, or is it in the works?
It's out in October. It's going to be a theatrical release, and it'll be on, I want to say HBO Plus, whatever their streaming service is. But he's a longtime fan, so I think he'll probably do it justice. What I hope is that he sets it up well with some information on this backstory, because I think that's a crucial part of the story. It's a cautionary tale in the same way that 1984 and Brave New World are.
Did you ever see the prequel to the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, Caprica? You ever see that show, Caprica?
Yes, I did. It's been a number of years, but yeah.
Yeah, I've been actually thinking about rewatching that, because I probably pick up more stuff on it now. But they really seem to understand a lot of that, and the reboot of Galactica was genius. I mean, just it was so good. And right now I'm watching season 2 of Westworld, and they're getting into some really heavy, interesting stuff. Along similar lines. It's regarding AI and it's like the robot beings, they call them the hosts, they're stuck in a loop. Like they're just doomed to keep repeating certain actions all the time, but the founders of Delios, I think, or something like that, Delos or something like that, is the organization that runs Westworld, is they're really studying the normal humans that go into there, and the AI is learning from the interactions of the humans with the hosts that are stuck in this loop. So more and more humans come in and interact with, and it's all a test loop for them to gain more knowledge and understanding for the AI, so that humans can achieve immortality, we would say parenthetically apart from God, through AI. And so on the one hand, you have the hosts, the artificial intelligent beings striving to become human, while at the same time you have the humans striving to become immortal through merging with the hosts, which is very similar to Caprica and the reboot of Battlestar Galactica. So this, I mean, is life emulating art here. I mean, we see all these artistic expressions, but we're seeing elements of that, even prophesied when you go back to 84 or Brave New World, but certainly in what's happening in the world today seems to be headed down this path.
I think so. I mean, this is the world that we live in, right? We're in the age of the techno sorcerers. We're technology and magic. That line that we've drawn between those two concepts for so long was really never there.
So we're into
we live in the quantum age. Where super colliders are being used to rip holes in the fabric of space-time, and we have quantum computers that dump their calculus into another dimension, literally, to derive an answer for whatever query that is, using qubits.
The D-Wave computer.
Yeah, I mean, that's, if that doesn't seem like magic, I don't know what it is. I mean, anthropologists wrote about this stuff for years, that in people who still operated with the mythological thinking, with a supernatural worldview, that high technology and magic, and Arthur C. Clarke wrote about this in Childhood's End too.
Yeah.
That there wasn't a distinction between magic and high technology, and we're at that point now. We have been for some time.
So has witchcraft simply evolved into a new technocratic form, as well as chemical with pharmakia? Are we just at the sort of the tail end of a logical progression from the primordial witchcraft introduced by the Watchers, which if that's true, if okay, the Book of Enoch says that those watchers would be judged, bound, and buried for 70 generations. And if my calculations are correct, I'm not saying they are, but if they are correct, it appears that the beginning of the 20th century was the end of that prison sentence, and that the watchers that were judged, bound, and buried, with the exception of the 4 buried in the River Euphrates, which have yet to come out, which will come out in the end times of Revelation. But I'm wondering if we've been experiencing sort of a progressive release of the watchers, because if I look at 5,000 years of human history, I mean, it's pretty much a beast of burden, and the same knowledge and transportation, everything's kind of a flat line, and then you hit the 20th century and it's like that we're seeing a resurgence of all this, but it's taking on a different format through the technical realm, through computers and things.
Yes, and I think that in many ways it's coming full circle. It's returning to the antediluvian setting, not necessarily in terms of the culture, but in terms of what the Watchers were passing along in terms of occult and magic knowledge. And I'm still a firm believer that there was a high technology that we don't completely understand that existed before the flood. I think that it was based in stone, but it wasn't lithic technology. It wasn't spear points and dart points. It was something else. And it probably mimicked. It probably mimicked in a lot of ways what our computers can do now. Mm-hmm. That's my suspicion.
I agree. I tend to wonder.
We get slivers of that, in the historical and archaeological record, but we don't completely understand that. But that's what my gut tells me.
Yeah, I've had the same suspicion for a long time, but believing that what we are now doing with microchips and computer technology, they were doing, in my opinion, with probably more naturalistic means, with probably having a greater understanding of stones and quartz and gems and
certainly I mean, you consider how many for like the Great Pyramid and any number of megaliths around the world, even stones that were used in the rock wall formations here in Texas have piezoelectric qualities. And the mortar that was used to put them in place had specific matching piezoelectric qualities. That's pretty significant. That's not that speaks to an understanding of currents and electricity at a time when the conventional academic community says that those kinds of things didn't exist.
Oh, for sure. And you have characters like Tesla, who was marginalized, but he seemed to understand like the earth currents, the ley lines, the magnetic field, and saying the same things like Earth is a realm. He would describe the Earth as a realm, and he clearly understood tapping into the ether, which is like Einstein's sole purpose was to nullify the ether. And then it's like everything to do with that understanding was pushed aside, and now we have everything that came out with who was it? I just went blank. Who was the guy that was in competition with Tesla that was funded by the light bulb guy? Edison, yeah.
J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan financed Edison to, basically, we don't want this stuff for free. We want to monetize it. So, everything Tesla was into was marginalized. But when you have, piezoelectric structures, stone that are built on ley lines, that tells you that they had an understanding of the Earth grid, of the Earth and ether for power. And you see sometimes fantasy dipictions of Atlantis with like gem controlled laser power. I don't think that's far from the truth. I think that they had a greater technology, but it was more earth-centric in simplicity than what we are clunking around with transistors and microchips and circuit boards.
I think I think that the conventional academic community has it right, and that it is a stone technology. It was a stone age, but it wasn't, like I say, it wasn't just, napping spear points and dart points,
Right.
and making, hand hammers and rock hammers and stuff like that. It goes far beyond that. These people clearly had a sophisticated understanding of minerals, and their technological uses.
Yeah, for sure. We got about 12 minutes left in the broadcast. I want to make sure that we let people know of any resources that you might have to offer in regards to this topic that you're on right now, in your study of witchcraft and anthropology and all that kind of stuff. So anything you want to close out the broadcast with, anything you're passionate about, any resources you want to point to, we've got about 11 minutes left of the broadcast.
Sure. Well, of course, people can get my book, Interview with the Giant. That's where I first wrote. There's a chapter in there called The Primal Witch that outlines this stuff. And also I have two forthcoming books on witchcraft. One is called The Book of the Gray, and it's a collection of essays that I've written on the history and culture of witchcraft. So there's a lot there that people can, they can fill in some gaps perhaps that they've had about the history of witchcraft. And then I'm also planning to publish my updated, edited version of my master's thesis, which was on neo-pagan witchcraft. And I've certainly got people can get a hold of me through burtonbeyond.com and tioba.org, which is the Institute of Biblical Anthropology website. And I'm on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. People can follow me there if they want to. And got a couple of projects. I've got a forthcoming book on Göbekli Tepe and the Bible coming out that I've written with Dr. Aaron Judkins.
Oh, cool.
And I'll be speaking on that at the Skywatch TV Rise conference in June. So lots going on for sure. Yeah. And I also teach classes on the subject of witchcraft through the biblical lens. There are two certification, all the certification programs, biblical anthropology, biblical demonology, and preternatural morphology will probably all be of interest to people, because there's going to be coursework on witchcraft in all three of those, and those are actually on sale for $125 this week. And also have an introduction to New Testament Greek for people who are interested in that. But there's a lot going on now in terms of pointing people to sources. I'm always going to, for material in the history of witchcraft, I'm always going to point people to Montague Summers. He wrote an excellent work, which is heavily sourced in a number of different languages. He was an amazing scholar. Wrote a book called The History of Witchcraft and Demonology, and I highly recommend that work. It stands the test of time as one of the best works on the history of witchcraft.
Very cool. You mentioned Dr. Aaron Judkins, who's also a friend of mine as well, and I have featured both of you in my seed story as yourselves. So you actually appear as yourself. I actually just recently, I should send it to you. Recently wrote a new section of interaction for your character. For your character as you, where he, I found a YouTube channel where a guy has collected strange and paranormal stories from the military. So anytime military men or women have had some kind of strange experience, he's kind of combed the internet for these things, and he just reads them. He reads the accounts, I guess, that they're being mailed to him or whatever. A lot of weird stuff, and some of them have been spun off into short stories. And one of them was about a guy who was paid to be in a sensory deprivation tank for an extended period of time, like more than the human mind can really take, and what this person experienced in there. And I was like, oh man, this is great stuff. So I took a spin-off of that and wrote it into the story. But this was sort of my antagonist's solution to the seed teams on the spiritual side of things was, well, let's stick them in sensory deprivation tanks. He sticks them in there for like 3 days straight, and they get kind of whacked out on it. But your character comes up to them, to the general, and says, listen, there's a spiritual component to all this stuff that because I have the troops attending one of your lectures, as part of their curriculum. And then you come up to the general later, or the colonel that's in charge of the curriculum, and you say, listen, there's a spiritual component to all this stuff, and if you're not equipping these guys for it, you're setting them up for destruction. So I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy what I've written in there. But
sounds like advice that I would give in that context.
Exactly. Well, that's why I put in there. Some of these discussions that we've had both on the air and off the air are making their way into Seed. So just so you know. We got some stuff
fantastic.
Yeah, that's gonna be fun. So we got about 6 minutes left in the broadcast. And there was a question I meant to ask you. I don't know if you can answer it in 6 minutes, but what does anthropology tell us about witchcraft that perhaps some other disciplines don't?
Quite a bit, actually. Anthropology has been one of those sciences that's sort of been on the cutting edge of understanding the supernatural. And most of the people that were responsible for writing ethnographies that brought that supernatural worldview to the fore spent time embedded with indigenous peoples, so that they were learning this stuff in real time on the ground. In other words, they weren't, in some archive. Not that there is value to document-based research, but they were interacting with living, breathing people, who lived in a working, functional culture. And so people like Bronislaw Malinowski and Margaret Mead and some of the people in the golden age of anthropology, we're looking at these peoples who were essentially living a kind of Stone Age, non-literate, non-industrial lifestyle, hunter-gatherers for the most part, and looking at their mythology, their culture, and the individuals that they identify as a witch, or that the cultures they were studying identified as what we would call a witch. All their descriptions seem to match up, so much so that this was one of the perennial features of so many of these cultures. I liken it to it's like the difference between somebody who's in the mission field and just maybe a layperson who's not, those kinds of experiences don't even enter into their world. But people in the mission field, and having done mission work yourself, you understand this. You see this stuff up close and personal in a mission field. The demonic is in your face in a lot of instances.
Oh man, when I was in India, like definitely, very much so.
Yeah, and so you encounter, and inevitably you encounter, the various cultures' versions of witches. These people who operate anathema to what is even considered normal and good within a given, or moral within a given culture. So, in that respect, anthropology has really been the focusing lens for I think better understanding witchcraft, and certainly for when you further focus it by using the lens of the biblical worldview.
Yeah.
You get this. That's how I came up with this concept of the primal witch.
That's interesting. Well, we don't have time to get into it because you're just talking about parasites, and I was like, man, when I was doing my research for Archon Invasion and looking into parasites and stuff like that, and seeing the very real aspect of parasitic mind control, that I mean, I'm talking biological parasites, but I think when you combine that with spiritual parasites, oof, that's a pretty rough combination for mind control.
Well, I mean that's at the heart of again that's a central part of witchcraft, is this demonic tutelage, this entity that's hitching a ride in somebody, because you're not going to, especially these primal witches, you're not going to find without some kind of demonization.
Hitchhikers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the good news is that people can get deliverance from that, through the blood of Christ, that you can be healed, set free, and delivered. Do you have resources in that regard that you could point to, or that you are maybe involved with, that anybody out there listening that may be a victim of this or may want to get set free from it, that you could point to in the next minute or so?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, people are I mean, you're really just a Google search away from, a host of deliverance ministries. But, we mentioned Greg Reed a couple of times. He's a great resource. He's got lots of experience in this field. So any, reaching out to people like Greg, is really what you want to do. Or again, just a fellow believer, because we're called to do this stuff too.
We're all called to do it. That's right. Hey, man, we are out of time now. Thank you so much, Judd. Always a pleasure having you on, and good conversation, man. Gets me thinking. So thanks again for coming on, bro.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, guys. We'll see you back next week on the Revolutionary Radio Project. Good night, everybody.